You will not believe who she really is. And what she said in that break room made him question everything. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly above the small break room, their cold hum blending with the soft clatter of trays and the occasional sigh from the exhausted employees. Sophie Reynolds pressed her face into her hands, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs, the weight of unpaid bills, late rent, and endless shifts pressing down on her chest like a heavy stone. Outside, the winter wind rattled the windows of the fast food restaurant, carrying the distant echo of traffic and the hollow sounds of a city moving without pause. Ethan Montgomery leaned against the edge of the doorframe, pretending to fix the creak of the old hinges, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his plain jacket. His eyes, sharp and attentive despite the mask of indifference, never left Sophie as she cried, each tear marking a small fracture in the composed exterior he had shown to the world just hours ago. He was not here as the head of a multi-million-dollar corporation, not as the CEO of the philanthropic foundation that bore his name, but as a man in faded jeans and a worn flannel, blending into the background, blending into the story of ordinary struggle that Sophie had not asked anyone to witness. She lifted her head for a brief moment, eyes red and glistening, and muttered softly under her breath about how nothing ever seemed to go right, about how she felt invisible, how the little kindness she had shown the stranger the day before had been her only lifeline in a world that often seemed to take more than it gave. Ethan adjusted his stance, pretending to check the time on a non-existent wristwatch, but each word Sophie spoke carved into his chest with a weight that was almost tangible. He remembered that morning, the cold drizzle at the train station, Sophie hesitating, counting her last bill, giving it away to a man she did not know, and how that single act had sparked something in him he could not yet name. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Sophie pushed back her chair and let out a trembling laugh, not because she was happy, but because she had reached the limit of exhaustion and had nothing left to contain the storm of emotion inside her. Ethan stepped quietly closer, stopping just a few feet away, and in a voice low enough to be almost a whisper, asked if she was okay, knowing full well that she did not owe him any explanation. Her eyes flicked up to him, wide and vulnerable, and for the briefest moment, recognition flitted across her features, though she could not place it, could not name the quiet intensity she felt emanating from the stranger in front of her. The room seemed to shrink around them, the distant sounds of the restaurant fading into nothing, leaving only the raw, human exchange of sorrow and compassion. Ethan offered her a simple gesture, a hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, a lifeline he could provide without breaking the careful balance of anonymity he had maintained. Sophie's lips trembled as she whispered a simple truth about how lost she had felt, how small her world had become, and how a single moment of understanding could feel like a beacon in the darkness. He nodded slowly, understanding more in that silence than any words could convey, the quiet gravity of her confession anchoring him in the moment and preparing both of them for a journey neither could yet predict, a journey that would test kindness, trust, and the unforeseen power of human connection in ways that would alter the course of their lives forever. The next morning arrived with a brittle chill that seeped through the cracked window panes of the small apartment building where Sophie Reynolds lived. She sat at the edge of her narrow bed, fingers wrapped tightly around the faded handle of her coffee mug, the bitter steam rising slowly as if trying to wake her from the lingering exhaustion of the previous night. Every muscle in her body ached from the long shifts at the fast food restaurant and the restless hours spent worrying about rent, overdue bills, and the missed interview that could have been her way out of this endless cycle. The pale sunlight fought through the thin curtains, casting slanted lines across the worn wooden floor, highlighting the scattered papers of job applications and sticky notes reminding her of deadlines she barely had the energy to meet. In her mind, she replayed the memory of the stranger at the train station, the man she had given her last $10 to, his eyes catching hers for a fleeting moment, carrying a quiet weight of gratitude that had left her heart warm despite the cold drizzle. She remembered how absurd it had felt to part with the last bit of money she had. Yet the thought of the relief it brought him had made her chest swell with a strange mixture of pride and fear. She had tried to focus on her tasks, but every ringing of the phone or knock at the door pulled her back into the gnawing uncertainty of her situation, reminding her how precarious life had become. Meanwhile, Ethan Montgomery had returned to his own carefully constructed world of pretense, walking the gray streets in worn jeans and a jacket that had seen better days, the chill of the morning wind biting at his cheeks. His mind lingered on the previous evening, on the cashier with the tear-streaked face and the vulnerability she had shown without realizing he was watching. He had not intended to intrude, yet he could not shake the impression that lingered in his chest, a tug of emotion that felt both unsettling and undeniably human. As he walked past crowded bus stops and steam rising from the vents of underground subway stations, he considered how easy it would have been for him to disappear, to let her struggle in silence. Yet something in him refused to do so. Back in the cramped kitchen of Sophie's apartment, she mechanically stirred the last of the instant coffee, the clinking of the spoon against the chipped ceramic cup echoing softly in the quiet room. Her cat, a small tabby she had rescued from the alley months ago, brushed against her leg, a small comfort in the vast loneliness that seemed to fill the space. She had hoped to find solace in planning the day ahead, perhaps to force herself to move forward. Yet her thoughts kept circling back to the stranger who had stood outside in the rain, a figure she could not fully understand, yet whose presence lingered as a reminder of something greater than the narrow confines of her own troubles. She dressed quickly, pulling on a threadbare sweater over her worn jeans, the cold seeping into her bones as she stepped outside, the city streets slick from last night's drizzle, puddles, reflecting the muted gray of the overcast sky. Ethan watched from a distance, careful not to be noticed, observing the rhythm of her steps, the way she paused occasionally to glance at the street signs, as if mapping out the labyrinth of her world. He noted how the small gestures, the way she carried herself despite exhaustion, spoke volumes about her resilience, a quality he had not expected to find so vivid in someone whose life seemed to offer so little. As the day unfolded, Sophie navigated the crowded sidewalks and noisy intersections, her mind torn between hope and resignation, unaware that the stranger who had observed her struggle was moving parallel to her path, contemplating how to bridge the gap between their worlds without shattering the delicate balance she had fought so hard to maintain. Every glance, every gesture, and every step they took brought them closer to a moment that neither could yet predict, a collision of circumstance and quiet human kindness that would set the stage for revelations that could change both of their lives in ways they could not imagine. The city around them continued its relentless pace, indifferent yet full of possibility, carrying them toward the unspoken tension of an encounter that would force Sophie to confront the fragility of her situation and Ethan to confront the depth of his own hidden empathy, building a sense of anticipation that hung in the air like the gray clouds above, pressing down on the rooftops, on the asphalt, and on the hearts of two strangers bound by an invisible thread of shared humanity. The day pressed on with an unrelenting gray sky that seemed to hang over every street and alley of the city, and Sophie Reynolds found herself moving from one job to the next, each shift blending into the next with little respite. She worked diligently behind the counter, her hands mechanically preparing orders, her eyes occasionally glancing up at the long line of customers who seemed oblivious to her exhaustion. The constant beep of the register and the hiss of the soda machine provided a rhythmic backdrop to her thoughts, which were consumed with worry over the rent due at the end of the week, the overdue electricity bill, and the promise she had made to herself not to fall behind again, despite the fatigue pulling at her shoulders and the dull ache in her feet. Sophie forced a polite smile to each customer, nodding and answering with a soft voice, a practice performance that masked the turmoil simmering inside. Behind her, the break room door remained slightly ajar, a faint reminder of the previous evening when her vulnerability had been witnessed by a stranger whose presence she had not even realized at the time. Across the city, Ethan Montgomery continued his quiet observations, blending seamlessly with the throng of ordinary pedestrians, his mind revisiting the images of Sophie, her sorrow raw and unfiltered, her small acts of kindness evident in the memory of the $10 bill she had handed to the man at the train station. He noted the way she carried herself, the small adjustments she made to keep her uniform clean, the subtle resilience in her movements, and the courage it must have taken to maintain composure despite the weight of her struggles. He had not intended to follow her, yet each turn of the street and each glance at the corner of a shop brought him closer to understanding the texture of her life, the intricate details that made her human and profoundly real. In the dim light of the afternoon, Sophie found herself alone in the break room for a brief moment, leaning against the worn countertop, the hum of the refrigerator a soft companion to her quiet contemplation. She pressed her palms to her face, rubbing the ache from her eyes, wishing for a pause that never seemed to come, a chance to simply breathe without the pressing demands of survival. Ethan, standing at a distance just outside the room, allowed himself a measured step forward, careful to remain unseen, yet eager to witness the small, intimate moments of her life, the moments that revealed her character more fully than any words could. She opened a small locker beneath the counter, retrieving a folded notebook in which she had been recording the hours worked, the tips earned, and the tiny victories she could claim as her own in a world that often overlooked her efforts. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, each number and note a testament to her diligence, to the persistence that had kept her afloat despite the relentless tide of responsibility. Ethan watched her hands trace the lines of her calculations, the subtle furrow of her brow, the quiet determination that radiated even in the most mundane tasks. The interaction with the stranger at the train station, the one act of selflessness she had offered without expectation, resonated through the day, echoing in her small gestures of care for customers, for co-workers, and for the community she inhabited even within the confines of the small restaurant. Time seemed to slow as she moved back to her station, setting the notebook aside, adjusting the apron tied around her waist, and taking a deep breath as she prepared for the next wave of orders. Outside, Ethan remained vigilant, aware that his own presence was an invisible thread connecting him to her world, a silent witness to her endurance, and a growing awareness that her small acts of courage and kindness were having a profound impact, even before he revealed himself. Every interaction, every careful movement of her hands, and every hesitant glance at the crowded floor carried weight, layers of narrative that he observed in a mixture of admiration and quiet anticipation, building toward the moment when their worlds would intersect more fully, when the reality of who he was and the truth of what she had done would collide to create a turning point that neither of them could yet foresee, a moment that would challenge perceptions, test trust, and begin to reshape the path of both their lives in ways that were as inevitable as they were unexpected. The moment Sophie Reynolds stepped out of the small fast food restaurant into the pale light of late afternoon, the city felt both overwhelming and familiar, its streets crowded with hurried pedestrians and honking taxis, yet carrying the faint scent of roasted coffee and damp asphalt that reminded her of the train station from the day before. She adjusted the strap of her worn messenger bag, glancing at the small folded notebook tucked inside, a record of every shift, tip, and errand she had painstakingly documented, each page a testament to her perseverance. Her feet moved quickly along the slick sidewalks, weaving through puddles and sidestepping discarded wrappers, each step a reminder of how far she had come in her struggle to keep life afloat. Meanwhile, Ethan Montgomery had parked a few blocks away in a discreet lot, watching the rhythm of her movements through the rearview mirror of his unremarkable sedan, noting how she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the exhaustion that weighed heavily on her. He had not approached her yet, choosing to observe, to understand the contours of her life, the way she interacted with her environment, and the subtle gestures that revealed the depth of her character. Sophie entered the narrow doorway of the community kitchen where she had arranged to volunteer, the warmth inside contrasting sharply with the chill of the streets. The smell of simmering vegetables and fresh bread enveloped her, and the low hum of conversation and clattering dishes created a rhythm that was both comforting and grounding. As she tied the apron around her waist, she could not help but reflect on the tiny act of kindness she had extended to the man at the train station, how it had felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating to give away her last $10 to a stranger. Ethan, still outside in the lot, adjusted his plain jacket and took a slow, measured breath, considering the lessons that had drawn him to this point. The fleeting moments of honesty and generosity he had witnessed, the way a single gesture could reveal the strength of a person's character, and how those moments resonated far beyond their immediate context. As the afternoon progressed, Sophie moved from task to task, her movements efficient but imbued with a quiet grace, a stark contrast to the weariness that had weighed on her only hours before, and each interaction, each smile exchanged, reinforced the silent narrative of her character that Ethan absorbed with keen attention. The sun began to lower, casting elongated shadows through the large kitchen windows, and Sophie paused briefly to stretch her arms, letting her gaze drift over the modest dining area, noticing the small details of worn chairs, chipped plates, and the careful organization that Ruth had instilled. Ethan, from his vantage point just outside, allowed himself a subtle nod of acknowledgement, a quiet recognition of the integrity and strength he had witnessed in the young woman. And he knew that this day, like the tattered pages of her notebook and the small, deliberate acts of kindness she performed, would leave an indelible mark, setting the stage for encounters and revelations that neither of them could yet foresee, but which promised to reshape the course of their lives in profound and unexpected ways. The evening air had cooled into a crisp bite that seeped through Sophie Reynolds's thin jacket as she stepped out of the community kitchen, the golden light from inside spilling onto the wet sidewalk and highlighting the patches of rain that still clung to the asphalt. She held her notebook close to her chest, the pages slightly bent from the day's work, each filled with meticulous records of shifts, tips, and small victories that she clung to like lifelines. As she navigated the crowded streets toward the subway, her mind replayed the subtle moments of the day, the gratitude in the eyes of the children she had served, the quiet nod of acknowledgement from Ruth as she moved with steady purpose, and the small acts of kindness she had performed without expectation of recognition. Meanwhile, Ethan Montgomery followed at a careful distance, blending into the throng of commuters with the practiced ease of someone used to observing without being noticed. His eyes never left her, taking in a measured way she walked, the careful adjustments to her bag strap, the way she paused to avoid puddles or to help a passerby with a stray umbrella. Each gesture told him more about her character than words ever could, and the memory of the $10 bill she had given to the stranger at the train station the day before resonated now with greater clarity, its significance magnified by the quiet consistency of her compassion throughout the day. Sophie descended the stairs into the subway, the echo of her shoes against the concrete steps blending with the low rumble of arriving trains and the murmur of other passengers, her mind occupied with the plan she had to make for the following day, the call she needed to return, and the sense of fatigue that had settled deep in her bones. Ethan adjusted the collar of his jacket, keeping his distance, observing as she swiped her transit card and stepped onto the crowded train, the subtle tension in her shoulders betraying the exhaustion she carried despite the outward calm. As the train moved through the tunnels, Sophie found a corner near the door and leaned against the cool metal, opening her notebook to review the notes she had scribbled throughout the day, the careful tally of work hours and small reminders of the kindnesses she had offered and received. Each entry was a thread in the fabric of her life, a delicate weave of perseverance, responsibility, and an underlying desire to connect with others even as the pressures of survival threatened to overwhelm her. Ethan, on the platform above, watched the doors close, noting how she instinctively protected her belongings, how her eyes scanned the passengers and the advertisements plastered across the walls, how she seemed both alert and weary, fully aware of her surroundings while navigating her own internal landscape of stress and determination. The train rocked gently along the tracks, and Sophie's gaze wandered to the window, reflecting the dim tunnel lights, as she allowed herself a brief moment to breathe, to consider the way small acts of human kindness could ripple outward in ways that were rarely noticed but deeply felt. Outside, Ethan followed her journey, making mental notes of the route she took, the stores she passed, and the small interactions that defined her daily life. Each one a piece of the puzzle he was quietly assembling to understand who she truly was beyond the surface of a cashier struggling to make ends meet. The rhythmic motion of the train, the ambient sounds of the passengers' conversations, and the occasional clatter of a dropped newspaper created a soundtrack for the unfolding scene, one in which both of them were connected by circumstance and observation, yet separated by the careful boundary Ethan maintained to preserve the integrity of his undercover presence. Sophie's hands rested on her notebook, fingers tracing the edges of her meticulously recorded lines, and she allowed herself a fleeting smile at the thought that even small, unnoticed gestures could carry meaning and weight, a lesson that Ethan had quietly absorbed from a distance, preparing him for the moment when their worlds would intersect in ways neither of them could yet predict, a convergence of empathy, understanding, and the latent potential for connection that had begun to take root in a shared rhythm of their days. The following afternoon, Sophie Reynolds found herself walking along the crowded sidewalk toward the small park near the corner of her neighborhood, the sun dipping low and casting long, golden streaks across the wet pavement. Her work apron was folded neatly inside her messenger bag, and she kept a tight grip on the strap as she navigated through clusters of people hurrying home from their own obligations. Each step was measured, deliberate, as if she were rehearsing how to maintain control of the chaos around her while her mind churned with the remnants of the day's fatigue and lingering worry about bills and missed opportunities. Ethan Montgomery trailed at a discreet distance, his plain jacket blending seamlessly with the passing crowd, his eyes focused entirely on her movements. He had made a point to maintain distance, to respect the unspoken boundary he had yet to cross, but the desire to engage, to offer guidance, or even just a comforting presence, grew stronger with each passing block. Sophie reached the park and paused near the edge of the fountain, watching the water ripple and glint in the fading sunlight, a small moment of reflection amid the endless demands of her life. She took a deep breath, savoring the brief calm, and let her gaze drift to a small group of children playing nearby, their laughter carrying lightly on the wind, an ephemeral contrast to the weight pressing on her own shoulders. Ethan adjusted his pace, ensuring he remained unseen, yet close enough to observe her interactions with the world. He noted the way she instinctively stepped aside for the elderly passerby, how she offered a smile to a mother juggling a stroller and a shopping bag, and how her eyes softened for the smallest details that others might overlook. Each observation reinforced the impression he had been forming over the past days, that Sophie's kindness was not performative but deeply ingrained, a genuine reflection of her character that transcended circumstance and fatigue. Sophie leaned against a nearby bench for a moment, pulling out her notebook to jot a few reminders for the following day, her handwriting careful and deliberate, each word a small assertion of control in a life that often felt overwhelmingly uncertain. The distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog provided a backdrop to her thoughts, a rhythm that allowed her to momentarily untangle the knots of anxiety that had accumulated. Ethan remained just beyond the edge of the park, hidden behind a tree trunk, observing the natural grace with which she navigated the environment, noting how even her gestures, small and seemingly mundane, carried weight and intention. He reflected on the previous encounters he had orchestrated to test her compassion and resilience, realizing that each situation she had faced, each choice she had made, revealed a depth of empathy and courage that he had not expected to witness. Sophie closed the notebook, standing fully and stretching slightly, the motion fluid despite the stiffness from hours spent on her feet. She allowed herself a moment to appreciate the warmth of the late afternoon sun on her face, the subtle shift in the air signaling the approaching evening, and the promise of a brief reprieve from the relentless demands of the day. Ethan took a cautious step forward, considering the moment when he might finally introduce himself, when the carefully maintained distance between their lives could be bridged without shattering the authenticity of her experiences. His gaze lingered on her as she began to walk toward the path that would take her home, noting the way she moved with purpose, the subtle signs of both resilience and vulnerability intertwined in her posture. Every gesture, every careful glance, and every measured step was cataloged in his mind, a record of human decency and quiet strength that demanded recognition. As Sophie disappeared from sight around the corner, Ethan remained for a moment, allowing himself a deep breath and a sense of anticipation for the first encounter that would change the trajectory of both their lives, a collision of empathy and hidden intention that had been building, silently and steadily, preparing them for the revelation that would soon challenge the boundaries of trust, perception, and the unforeseen possibilities that lay ahead in the unfolding narrative of their shared story. The following morning arrived with a quiet intensity that seemed to press down on the streets of the city, the pale sunlight filtering through the mist and casting a soft glow on the sidewalks as Sophie Reynolds made her way toward the small office building where she had agreed to meet the volunteer coordinator for the first time. Her steps were brisk, each movement deliberate as she clutched the strap of her messenger bag, feeling the weight of the notebook tucked inside, a constant reminder of her careful record keeping and the persistence that had carried her through so many difficult days. Ethan Montgomery, waiting at a nearby cafe under the pretense of reading the newspaper, observed her approach with measured attention, his plain jacket and casual demeanor allowing him to blend effortlessly into the morning crowd. He had chosen the spot deliberately, knowing that the building would funnel her past his line of sight, giving him the opportunity to gauge her demeanor, her interactions with the environment, and the small nuances of her expressions that revealed more than words ever could. Sophie paused at the entrance, adjusting the scarf around her neck against the slight chill in the air, and took a moment to steady her breath before pushing the door open and stepping into the warmth of the office lobby. The smell of coffee and printer ink mixed with the subtle scent of polished wood, a comforting contrast to the cold gray streets outside. She approached the receptionist, exchanged pleasantries, and was led to the coordinator, who welcomed her with a warm smile and a firm handshake. As they spoke, Sophie could feel the tension in her shoulders ease slightly, the routine of introductions and explanations grounding her in the moment, yet her mind remained alert, aware of the responsibilities and expectations that awaited her. Outside, Ethan noted every detail, from the slight furrow in her brow as she listened intently to instructions, to the careful way she organized her belongings on the small desk provided for her, each gesture a testament to her diligence and her adaptability. He reflected on the brief encounters they had shared, the small acts of kindness she had displayed, and the resilience she had shown under pressure, and he realized that these qualities were precisely what had drawn him into this experiment of observation. Sophie was introduced to a few of the other volunteers, and she moved among them with a polite smile and quiet curiosity, asking thoughtful questions and offering assistance wherever she could, her natural empathy evident in the way she engaged with each person. Ethan sipped his coffee slowly, considering the right moment to make his presence known without disturbing the flow of her day or revealing too much too soon. He understood that patience was essential, that the value of observation lay not only in watching, but in understanding the context and subtlety of her actions. As Sophie settled into her tasks, unpacking supplies, preparing materials, and arranging items with meticulous care, Ethan reflected on the contrast between her modest life and his hidden reality, the duality of his existence as both observer and participant in this unfolding story of human connection. He noted the small moments that would otherwise go unnoticed, the way she offered encouragement to a nervous new volunteer, how she adjusted the height of a table for someone with a back injury, the gentle nod she gave when a child expressed gratitude, and he felt an increasing sense of admiration for the integrity and warmth she carried through every interaction. The morning passed in a steady rhythm, each movement, each exchange, and each quiet gesture weaving a tapestry of character that Ethan recorded silently in his mind, preparing for the moment when the careful balance between anonymity and revelation would tip, and the worlds of observer and observed would intersect in a way that would challenge both of them, revealing not only the hidden depths of compassion and resilience within Sophie Reynolds, but also the evolving awareness of Ethan Montgomery's own values, and setting the stage for the transformative encounter that would redefine their understanding of trust, kindness, and the unforeseen power of a human connection that had quietly been building across the city streets, through rain, cold, and long hours of unnoticed labor. The late afternoon sun had begun to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet streets as Sophie Reynolds carefully folded the supplies she had been using throughout the day at the community kitchen. Her muscles ached from hours spent bending, lifting, and organizing, but a quiet satisfaction settled over her as she surveyed the orderly space, the tables cleared and the food stored neatly for the next service. She took a deep breath, savoring the brief moment of calm, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant chatter of departing volunteers forming a gentle backdrop to her thoughts. Clutching her notebook against her chest, she reflected on the encounters of the day, the small acts of kindness she had witnessed and performed, and the quiet rhythm that had guided her through each task with purpose and care. As she stepped outside into the crisp air, the cool breeze tugged gently at her jacket, and the fading light painted the buildings in hues of gold and amber, the city carrying on with its relentless pace, indifferent yet full of opportunity. Ethan Montgomery, positioned discreetly a block away and partially hidden behind a tree, observed her movements with a careful eye, noting the way she adjusted her bag strap, the slight furrow of her brow as she scanned the street for safe passage, and the subtle shifts in her posture that betrayed a combination of fatigue and unwavering determination. He had spent days tracing these small gestures, building a detailed understanding of her resilience and character, and now he felt it was the right moment to step forward, not yet fully revealing who he was, but offering a hand of opportunity that could bridge the gap between her world and his own. Sophie continued along the sidewalk, her mind occupied with practical concerns about rent, upcoming shifts, and the promise she had made to herself to maintain stability despite the precariousness of her circumstances. She paused briefly at a crosswalk, glancing at a street musician playing a soft melody on a worn guitar, and allowed herself a small smile at the reminder that even amidst struggle, beauty could be found in unexpected places. Ethan stepped slightly closer, remaining just out of her direct line of sight, and placed a folded envelope against the base of a lamppost, making certain it would be discovered without drawing attention. Inside was a simple note expressing appreciation for her dedication and a modest invitation to participate in a new program at the community kitchen, along with a small amount of money to cover incidental expenses, enough to demonstrate genuine support without overstepping boundaries. Sophie approached the lamppost later that evening, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized the envelope, and she hesitated for a moment before opening it, curiosity mingled with caution and a flicker of warmth spreading through her chest at the unexpected act of kindness. She read the words carefully, her fingers tracing the lines, feeling the sincerity behind each phrase, and a thought occurred to her that perhaps someone had noticed her efforts and intended to reward not just the work she performed, but the character and heart she had shown throughout her days. Ethan watched from a distance, unseen, noting the small change in her expression, the way her shoulders relaxed slightly, the hint of hope and renewed energy that seemed to accompany the realization that her actions had been recognized. The evening light faded into a cool twilight, and the street lamps flickered on, casting pools of soft illumination on the pavement, as Sophie carefully folded the note back into the envelope, tucking it safely into her bag, and continuing toward home with a lighter step and a subtle, cautious smile. Ethan allowed himself a quiet moment of satisfaction, aware that the carefully orchestrated gesture had achieved its purpose, strengthening the trust and potential connection between them, and setting the stage for the forthcoming encounters in which the boundaries between observation and participation, between stranger and ally, would begin to dissolve, drawing both of them into a narrative of empathy, compassion, and and the slow unfolding of a relationship built on mutual respect and understanding that had been quietly developing beneath the surface of ordinary days. The following morning brought a crisp chill that pressed gently against the windows of Sophie Reynolds' small apartment. The sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting a muted glow across the worn wooden floor and the scattered papers of job applications she had been reviewing late into the night. Sophie stood by the sink, rinsing a mug from breakfast, her mind swirling with unease as she thought about the rumors that had begun to circulate among the volunteers and staff at the community kitchen. Whispers of favoritism, speculation about who had helped whom, and subtle insinuations that she had somehow gained opportunities through unseen connections gnawed at her confidence, and a dull ache settled in her chest, heavier than the physical fatigue from long hours on her feet. She ran her hands through her hair, tugging slightly at the strands that had fallen loose, and let out a slow breath, attempting to steady the rising tide of doubt and frustration. Meanwhile, Ethan Montgomery observed from across the street, his plain jacket and unremarkable appearance allowing him to blend seamlessly into the early morning crowd, his eyes fixed carefully on her movements. He noted the small shifts in her expression, the way she tightened her grip on the strap of her bag as she left her apartment and walked briskly down the sidewalk, as if bracing herself for the unspoken judgments that might follow her through the day. Sophie's steps carried her past the familiar storefronts, the scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee spilling from the bakeries and cafes along the route, offering brief moments of sensory distraction from the pressure of the rumors. Each footfall seemed heavier than the last, weighed down by the invisible scrutiny she imagined behind every glance and the subtle tension that seemed to hang in the air around the community kitchen. Upon arriving at the center, Sophie paused briefly, taking a deep breath before stepping inside, her eyes scanning the room for familiar faces and potential judgment. She exchanged polite greetings with the other volunteers, yet the whispers and cautious glances did little to ease the sense of isolation that had crept into her thoughts overnight. Ethan remained just outside, careful to maintain distance while considering the best way to intervene, to bridge the growing gap between perception and reality without revealing his own identity prematurely. As Sophie moved to begin her tasks, arranging supplies and preparing materials for the day's activities, her fingers brushed against the folded envelope Ethan had left the previous evening, tucked safely in her bag. She allowed herself a small smile at the memory of the note, the subtle acknowledgement of her efforts, and the encouragement it contained, though the weight of suspicion and misunderstanding threatened to dim that warmth. Each action she took, from organizing utensils to assisting newcomers, was measured and precise, an outward display of competence masking the internal conflict she felt. Ethan, hidden behind a column near the entrance, observed every movement, noting the resilience and quiet integrity that carried her through the moments of uncertainty. He considered the balance she maintained between composure and emotion, the way she interacted with those around her despite the whispers and subtle hints of mistrust. As the morning progressed, the murmurs among the volunteers grew louder, some questioning her motivations, others debating the fairness of opportunities she had received, and Sophie felt the tension pressing against her resolve like a tangible weight. She paused for a moment, straightening her back and taking a deep breath, reminding herself of the small victories she had achieved, the acts of kindness that had been genuine and unselfish, and the principles that guided her even when others failed to understand. Ethan allowed himself a slow exhale, recognizing the moment as critical, a juncture where intervention could provide clarity and reassurance. But he remained patient, knowing that timing was crucial and that any misstep could compromise the authenticity of the connection he hoped to cultivate. Each glance, each careful motion, and each subtle gesture between Sophie and the environment around her created a complex tapestry of trust, resilience, and unseen human bonds that both defined her character and quietly influenced Ethan's understanding, setting the stage for the impending revelation and the resolution of misunderstanding that would ultimately reinforce the foundation of empathy, respect, and connection that had been silently building between them over the past days. The tension in the community kitchen reached a peak as Sophie Reynolds went about her morning tasks. Her movements precise, but her mind weighed down by the swirling rumors and unspoken judgments from some of the other volunteers. Each glance she received seemed to carry a question, a suspicion, or an unvoiced critique, and she felt the familiar knot of frustration and self-doubt tighten in her chest. The chatter of the volunteers, usually a comforting background, now seemed edged with whispers that carried further than she had anticipated, and the subtle stares from the corner of the room made her acutely aware of how visible she had become without intending to be. Ethan Montgomery watched from his usual distance, noting the subtle tension in her posture, the slight stiffening of her shoulders, and the way her eyes darted occasionally toward the groups gathered around the tables. He could sense her unease and knew that the moment had come to step forward and provide clarity, to bridge the gap between misunderstanding and truth, without diminishing the authenticity of the life she had been living or the effort she had undertaken on her own. Sophie moved quickly to gather supplies, her hands shaking slightly as she carried a stack of containers toward the counter, and a quiet exclamation of surprise from fellow volunteer caused her pause. She looked up to see Ethan stepping into the room, no longer hidden behind the exterior of distance, his casual appearance and unassuming demeanor contrasting sharply with the clarity and certainty of the presence he now projected. The room seemed to shift around them as he approached, and Sophie felt a mixture of surprise, wariness, and tentative curiosity as he spoke her name gently, explaining that he had been observing not out of judgment, but out of admiration and concern. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of unspoken truths as he detailed the reasons for his previous distance, the intent behind the note left at the lamppost, and the subtle guidance he had tried to provide without disrupting her daily life. Sophie listened, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the counter, as a slow realization spread through her mind, each word unraveling the tension and confusion that had built over the past days. She noted the sincerity in his eyes, the careful pacing of his explanations, and the deliberate avoidance of condescension, and she felt the knot in her chest begin to loosen, replaced by a cautious sense of understanding. The murmurs and sideways glances of the other volunteers faded into a distant hum, eclipsed by the direct and honest exchange unfolding before her. And for the first time in days, Sophie allowed herself to breathe deeply, the tightness in her shoulders easing with each carefully considered sentence Ethan offered. He continued, describing how her consistency, her kindness, and her integrity had been the true measures of her character, and how the actions he had witnessed were exactly what had compelled him to take a careful interest, not to intervene prematurely, but to ensure that recognition and opportunity aligned with her merit and dedication. Sophie's lips parted slightly as she absorbed the weight of the words, the clarity of intention, and the validation of her unseen efforts, feeling a warmth bloom within her that contrasted with the cold uncertainty she had carried for so long. The light from the high windows glinted off the surfaces of the counters and tables, illuminating the scene with a soft, almost ethereal quality, marking a turning point where the careful balance between observer and participant dissolved into a moment of shared understanding. Ethan offered a subtle, encouraging smile, giving her space to respond, to process, and to reclaim her agency in the narrative that had so suddenly shifted, and Sophie met his gaze with a mixture of cautious hope and tentative relief, realizing that the path ahead, though still uncertain, was now illuminated by truth, trust, and a clear acknowledgement of her resilience, kindness, and the quiet strength that had brought her to this point, setting the stage for a new chapter in which both of their lives could intersect with honesty, empathy, and the promise of a deeper connection. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the streets as Sophie Reynolds moved through the familiar city blocks with a renewed sense of purpose. Her steps were measured, confident, and carried an undercurrent of determination that had been steadily building over the past days. The notebook she carried was no longer just a record of hours and shifts. It had become a journal of insights, small victories, and observations that she planned to implement in the new community project she had been entrusted with. Ethan Montgomery walked a few paces behind, keeping a careful distance to allow her space, yet staying close enough to gauge her reactions and the subtle changes in her demeanor. Today marked the beginning of her leadership role in the initiative, a program designed to bring meals and essential supplies to those who struggled to access them, and the responsibility weighed on her with both excitement and trepidation. Sophie arrived at the community kitchen and was greeted with warm smiles from the volunteers who had come to assist, some familiar, others new faces eager to contribute. She took a deep breath, tying the apron snugly around her waist, feeling the weight of responsibility and the sense of pride that accompanied it. She moved confidently through the space, distributing tasks, organizing materials, and coordinating with the volunteers, her voice calm but assertive, guiding the group with clarity and empathy. Ethan observed silently from a corner, noting how naturally she assumed leadership without the need to dominate or control, her ability to inspire cooperation and efficiency evident in every interaction. Sophie checked the schedule, assigned responsibilities for food preparation and distribution, and moved to help a volunteer struggling with a heavy box of supplies, demonstrating the balance of authority and participation that defined her approach. As the morning progressed, the kitchen hummed with activity, a symphony of chopping, stirring, and quiet conversation, and Sophie moved seamlessly between tasks, offering encouragement and subtle guidance, her presence both reassuring and motivating. Ethan could see how her genuine concern for the well-being of others translated into action, her empathy shaping the way she led the program, ensuring that every participant, whether volunteer or recipient, felt valued and respected. When the first deliveries of prepared meals were ready, Sophie coordinated the loading of the vehicles, checking lists and confirming routes, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. Ethan watched her cross-reference names and addresses, the meticulous attention to detail, revealing a blend of organizational skill and compassion that went beyond the requirements of the task. He noted the quiet pride in her posture, the way her eyes lit up when a volunteer thanked her for guidance, and the satisfaction that accompanied each completed task, small and large. By mid-afternoon, the program was fully underway, with meals being delivered to families and individuals in need, and Sophie walked among the volunteers, offering encouragement and noting areas for improvement, her hands moving deftly to assist wherever she was needed. Ethan remained at a respectful distance, yet he could not help but feel a swelling admiration for the woman who had transformed her challenges into a force for good, her ability to lead with kindness and integrity, leaving an indelible impression on him. As the sun dipped lower, painting the city in shades of amber and rose, Sophie paused for a moment outside the kitchen, looking at the small fleet of delivery vehicles lined up and the volunteers gathering for a brief debrief. Ethan stepped forward slowly, finally bridging the distance between observation and interaction, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet acknowledgement of her accomplishments, a shared recognition of the dedication, courage, and humanity that had defined this day and laid the foundation for the deeper connection that had been quietly building between them over time. The evening had settled into a calm, golden haze as Sophie Reynolds stepped out of the community kitchen, her muscles still tingling with the exertion of the day, and the faint aroma of cooked vegetables and bread lingered in the air around her. The streets were quieter now, the late afternoon crowd thinning, leaving a soft hum of distant traffic, and the occasional pedestrian passing by. Her thoughts lingered on the success of the day's deliveries, the smiles on the faces of those who had received the meals, and the sense of purpose that had filled her every movement, transforming routine tasks into moments of tangible impact. Ethan Montgomery followed at a discreet distance, his plain jacket blending seamlessly with the early evening crowd, and he observed her with a careful attention born of days of silent watching and reflection. As she paused at a crosswalk, adjusting the strap of her messenger bag and glancing at the notebook tucked safely inside, he took a step closer, aware that the moment had arrived to reveal more than just gestures and anonymous encouragement. Sophie continued toward the park at the end of the block, her pace unhurried but confident, and Ethan closed the distance, approaching in a way that was deliberate yet gentle, ensuring that his presence was felt without startling her. He called her name softly, and when she turned, the slight hesitation in her eyes was met with a reassuring smile, a mixture of warmth and calm that immediately eased the tension that had built over weeks of uncertainty and careful observation. He extended his hand, not just in greeting, but as a symbol of acknowledgement for the integrity, diligence, and kindness she had demonstrated consistently. And Sophie, after a brief pause, took it with a mixture of surprise and cautious trust, feeling the weight of the moment settle around them like the soft glow of the evening light. Ethan spoke clearly, explaining that he had been the one to leave the note, that he had observed her not to judge, but to appreciate, and that her acts of compassion and dedication had inspired a level of respect that he could not ignore. Sophie listened, her fingers brushing lightly against his as she absorbed the sincerity in his tone, the steady cadence of his words offering both clarity and affirmation. The warmth of the late sun, filtered through the branches of nearby trees, created patterns of light and shadow across the pavement, mirroring the mixture of emotions stirring within her. Ethan produced a small, neatly wrapped box from his jacket, presenting it with a modest, hopeful gesture, explaining that it contained a token of his appreciation, a simple symbol of recognition for the thoughtfulness she had shown, and Sophie's eyes widened slightly as she accepted it, feeling the subtle pulse of excitement and curiosity rise within her. Inside the box lay a carefully selected ring accompanied by a folded note, the words written with careful deliberation expressing gratitude, respect, and admiration, connecting directly to the gestures and kindness she had offered long before she knew anyone had noticed. Sophie turned the note over in her hands, reading each line with deliberate care, and the impact of the words, coupled with the significance of the gesture, left her momentarily speechless, a quiet sense of wonder and validation blooming within her chest. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on hers, patient and steady, allowing her the space to process the meaning behind the gift, the affirmation of her character, and the acknowledgement of the quiet power of her empathy and resilience. As the sun dipped lower, casting the city in shades of rose and amber, the park seemed to cocoon them in a private world, a gentle pause in time where the complexity of past struggles, the unfolding recognition, and the potential of shared understanding converged, creating a moment that was intimate, meaningful, and transformative. Sophie finally looked up from the box, meeting Ethan's gaze with a soft, genuine smile, and the quiet acknowledgement between them spoke volumes about the respect, trust, and growing connection that had been cultivated through observation, patience, and unspoken empathy, marking a pivotal moment where their shared journey of kindness, understanding, and human connection reached a point of emotional fulfillment and anticipation for the chapters yet to unfold. The sun had fully set, leaving the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, their reflections dancing across the wet asphalt from an earlier drizzle, as Sophie Reynolds stepped out of the community kitchen one final time for the evening. The quiet hum of the city carried a sense of closure, a gentle reminder that the day's labors had come to a satisfying end. She adjusted her jacket, feeling the weight of the notebook that had become a constant companion, filled with records, reminders, and reflections that chronicled the journey she had undertaken over the past weeks. Her mind traced the events that had led to this moment, the small acts of kindness, the perseverance through fatigue and doubt, and the patience she had maintained in the face of whispers and misunderstandings. Ethan Montgomery waited just a few paces behind, his presence no longer hidden, his eyes reflecting the warm glow of the streetlights as he stepped closer, signaling the conclusion of the careful observation and silent admiration that had guided his interactions. He reached her side and spoke softly, acknowledging the dedication, resilience, and compassion she had shown, not just in the community kitchen, but in the subtle, everyday choices that defined her character. Sophie listened, her heart lifting as the weight of the previous uncertainties eased, the clarity of his words washing over her with a quiet sense of validation and understanding. He then gestured toward a small park bench nearby, inviting her to sit with him. And as they took their places, the soft rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of traffic created a calm, reflective atmosphere. Ethan carefully retrieved a small, neatly wrapped box from his jacket pocket, placing it gently in her hands and explaining that it contained a symbol of recognition for her efforts, integrity, and the genuine kindness she had consistently demonstrated. Sophie opened the box to find a simple yet elegant ring, accompanied by a handwritten note that echoed the sentiments he had expressed moments before, connecting directly to the gestures and consideration she had shown in her daily life. Her eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and joy, the tangible acknowledgement of her contributions and character creating a sense of closure and emotional fulfillment. She looked up to meet Ethan's gaze, and in that moment, the uncertainty and distance that had defined their interactions dissolved, leaving only mutual respect, trust, and a profound sense of connection. The city around them continued its rhythm, indifferent yet beautiful, as they sat together, speaking quietly and reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this intersection of lives, where honesty, empathy, and patience had cultivated a deep and lasting bond. The ring and the note represented not merely a gesture of admiration, but a bridge between two worlds, an acknowledgement of shared humanity and the understanding that integrity and kindness are recognized and valued. Sophie gently clasped the ring, feeling the weight of its significance, and a soft smile spread across her face, mingling with the warm light that bathed them both. Ethan's expression mirrored her relief and contentment, a quiet affirmation that the effort, observation, and care invested over time had culminated in a moment of clarity and emotional resonance. Together, they stood and walked back toward the main street, their steps synchronized, a shared rhythm reflecting the alignment of understanding, respect, and the beginnings of a partnership grounded in compassion and mutual appreciation. The streets, once a backdrop to individual struggle, now framed a narrative of connection and resolution. Each lamppost, storefront, and pavement echoing the journey of two individuals whose paths had converged through empathy, patience, and the simple yet powerful acts that had revealed the best in both of them. As they disappeared into the evening, the city lights casting a warm glow around them, the story reached a clear and satisfying conclusion, with Sophie and Ethan poised to continue their lives together, united by trust, admiration, and the profound understanding that kindness, integrity, and patience can transform not only individual moments, but entire lives.